My wife and my friend was behaving suspiciously. I checked her phone and found the truth. The weekend started like any other adventure we'd shared with our friends. My wife, a few close friends, and I had been planning the camping trip for months. It was meant to be a break from our usual grind, a weekend to unplug, share stories around a fire, and enjoy the kind of laughter you only get when you're surrounded by people who know you best. My wife and I had been together since college, and after all these years, she was more than just my partner, she was my best friend. My confidant, and someone I trusted without a shadow of a doubt. We'd built a life that was solid, and it felt like nothing could shake that foundation. As I packed up the tent and double-checked the supplies, I watched her chatting with our friends, her laugh echoing through the crisp morning air. She was so full of life, so comfortable with everyone. One couple we'd invited had been friends of ours since college, and even though we didn't hang out often, they were like family. The other couple had come into our lives more recently, but we'd all grown close, bonding over countless game nights and dinners. Together, we were a tight-knit group. That morning, as we prepared to head back, the campsite was a scene of organized chaos. Coolers were being packed, tents were coming down, and everyone was in high spirits. I took a few moments to reflect on how lucky I was to have these friendships, this stability, and my wife by my side through it all. I watched her as she helped our friends clean up the area. Her face lit up by the sun and felt a familiar warmth of gratitude. The air was filled with the smell of the extinguished campfire, and as we started loading the car, I couldn't help but feel that sense of accomplishment you get after spending days living simply. I knew we were tired, but there was also this quiet satisfaction that comes from being away from technology, work stress, and all the noise of regular life. Our friends teased each other as they packed up their own cars, laughing and making jokes about who'd been the best campfire storyteller, who'd tripped over their tent pegs the most, and how we'd all be sore for a week after sleeping on the ground. But in the back of my mind, I felt something, a whisper of unease that I couldn't quite place. It was subtle, easy to ignore in the face of good company and happy memories. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the fatigue from the weekend and the slight sadness of having to return to real life. We all hugged and said our goodbyes, promising to do it again soon, and slowly began to make our way back home. On the drive home, the weekend's easygoing vibe had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Normally, after a trip, my wife would chatter about everything we did, the funny stories, and ideas for our next getaway. But this time, her voice barely filled the car. I tried to focus on the road, thinking maybe she was just tired or had something on her mind. My thoughts drifted back to the moment I'd caught out of the corner of my eye earlier that morning. Her and our friend standing at the edge of the campsite. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a hand on her hip as she bent down, his fingers grazing her lower back. But then I'd seen her smile. A flash of something that was too familiar, too intimate. The scene replayed in my mind in fragments, snippets I couldn't shake, his hand lingering, her smiling back instead of brushing it off. It was the kind of interaction that crossed a boundary, something only I thought I'd shared with her. That small moment left a mark one couldn't ignore. During the drive, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. Every mile felt like I was getting closer to something I didn't want to uncover but couldn't avoid. I had replayed it over and over, rationalizing it in as many ways as I could, reminding myself that we'd all been close for years. They'd been friends even before we were together. So maybe I just misinterpreted the moment. Yet, the doubt crept in, its claws sinking in deep enough that I knew I couldn't ignore it. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I was caught in a tug of war with myself. Part of me wanted to let it go, chalk it up to nothing more than a passing misinterpretation. But another part of me, the part that felt wounded and raw, needed answers. She asked if I'd help unload the car, her voice as light and easy as always, and I forced a smile. Nodding, we worked in silence, but beneath my calm exterior, my mind raced. Every glance she threw my way felt different. Every small gesture seemed calculated in a way it hadn't before. It was as if something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to shake it. After we brought the last of the bags inside, she leaned in for a quick kiss, one I barely returned. It was subtle, something she probably didn't notice, but it felt like an acknowledgement to me, a reminder that things weren't quite the same. I watched her head to the shower, the door clicking shut behind her, Alone in the quiet of our home, I sat on the couch, my mind still looping through those moments, looking for some explanation or reassurance that wasn't there. I hated the idea of mistrust. I'd never been the type to jump to conclusions, let alone spy or snoop. But this time felt different. The nagging thought that there was more to uncover hung over me like a weight I couldn't ignore. As much as I tried to brush it off, something inside me knew that if I didn't confront this, it would only fester, growing into something that would consume everything we'd built. That night, I could barely sleep. I lay next to her, listening to her steady breathing, feeling like an outsider in my own bed. Every time I closed my eyes, that scene from the campsite played on repeat. I thought about asking her right then and there, just turning over and telling her what I saw, what it made me feel. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if she brushed it off or made me feel foolish for doubting her? The fear of sounding paranoid kept me quiet. In the days that followed, I watched them more closely. Every time we met up with friends, I looked for signs, clues, anything that would reassure me or confirm my suspicions. At times, I convinced myself it was all in my head. But then, one evening, I came home to find her texting on the couch. Her face lit up when she saw me. But something about her reaction felt off, like she was covering something up. She quickly closed her phone and asked how my day was. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I reminded myself that we'd been together since college, that she'd never given me a reason to doubt her until now. But my gut screamed otherwise. She'd become more guarded with her phone, keeping it close, changing her passcode. It was subtle, but noticeable enough to gnaw at me. And then, one evening, as we were sitting down to dinner, her phone lit up with a notification. She glanced at it quickly and flipped the screen down. It wasn't like her to hide things from me, and that small act left a sour taste in my mouth. Later that night, while she showered, I found myself standing in our living room, staring at her iPad. It sat on the table, and I knew it was synced to her phone. I knew the passcode too. She'd given it to me years ago, and she hadn't changed it. My heart pounded as I considered what I was about to do. Part of me screamed that this was a line I'd regret crossing, that I should just trust her and let it go. But the other part, the part that couldn't let go of that image of her and him at the campsite, needed closure. I grabbed the iPad and unlocked it. Her messages were right there, syncing from her phone. At first, everything looked normal. Conversations with her friends, family, coworkers. But then I saw a thread with his name. Hesitating for a moment, I opened it. The first few messages were casual, innocent. Even, they talked about work, about their shared friends. Then, as I scrolled back through months of texts, I noticed a change in tone. There were flirtations, teasing that felt too familiar, photos I couldn't unsee. And then, I found messages where they openly talked about sneaking around, about keeping things quiet, and waiting for the right time. My heart felt like it was being torn apart. I scrolled faster, my eyes burning as I scanned their words. They'd been meeting up for months. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. She was texting him from our home, from our bed. I took screenshots of every message and saved them on my phone. Feeling cold, hollow, I knew the path I was taking would change everything. But I couldn't stop. The trust we'd built over the years was shattered in an instant, replaced by a deep, painful emptiness. When she came back to the bedroom that night, she looked at me with the same warm smile, the same love I thought was real. And all I could do was lie there, pretending everything was fine, knowing that the person I trusted most in the world had betrayed me. I spent the next few days in a strange, hollow state, moving through the motions of everyday life while my mind raced endlessly. I couldn't shake the images of those messages, the secret exchanges, the plans they'd made under the guise of friendship. At every corner of my mind, the truth lurked, impossible to ignore, reminding me of what I'd uncovered. At home, I did everything I could to act normal. I didn't want to raise her suspicions. I had all the evidence saved and backed up in case things went sideways. But my behavior was already starting to change. I caught myself giving short responses to her usual questions, keeping my distance. She must have noticed because, one evening, she sat across from me at the dinner table and asked, with her usual concerned expression, "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, nodding and forcing a smile. Inside, though, I was screaming. All I wanted to do was lay everything out, to confront her, to ask her why she'd done this. But I held back, knowing that if I confronted her now, In a moment of anger, I might not handle it the way I needed to. I wasn't just her husband in this. I was a man looking for closure on the life he thought he'd built. Over the next few days, I reached out to a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone else yet. Not even my closest friends. As much as I wanted to unload this nightmare, I couldn't bring myself to share it. Part of me felt ashamed, humiliated by the thought of people knowing that my wife had been having an affair, especially with someone we both knew. Someone she'd brought into our life with an almost casual ease. How long had she been laughing behind my back, letting him into moments that were supposed to be ours? The lawyer advised me to gather as much evidence as possible. To protect myself financially, I started taking stock of our shared assets, our finances, even our joint bank accounts. The more I prepared, the more it felt like I was watching my own life disintegrate in front of me, piece by piece. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, she asked me to come with her to our favorite coffee shop. We hadn't had any time in weeks, she pointed out, and she wanted to reconnect, to make sure we weren't drifting. The irony of her words hit me so hard I could barely answer her. As we sat across from each other, her eyes warm and inviting, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. She was holding back secrets, and all her warmth felt hollow, scripted. I could barely bring myself to meet her gaze, and I think she sensed that something was off because she reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "What's going on?" she asked softly, her eyes searching mine. At that moment, I felt the words building in my throat. I wanted to tell her I knew everything, that I had seen the messages, the photos, the whole charade they'd been playing at my expense. But I kept my voice even, my gaze steady, and simply said, "I've just had a lot on my mind." She squeezed my hand, reassuring me in a way that made my stomach turn. It was an act, and we both knew it. I wondered how many other times she'd sat across from me, playing this same part, with those same secrets between us. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I'd let it get this far. This was the woman I'd vowed to share my life with, the person I thought I'd grow old beside. But now, everything we had felt tainted, like a memory that had been warped beyond recognition. I knew I couldn't keep pretending forever. I couldn't keep this up. Day after day, watching her lie to me with that smile, that warmth that I used to think was genuine. The next step was inevitable. I'd prepared as much as I could, and I knew it was time to set the wheels in motion. The life we had together was over. All that remained now was to face the truth head-on. To break free from the illusion I'd been clinging to. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew it was the only way forward. The next morning, I woke up before she did, a plan finally clear in my mind. I'd spent so many sleepless nights trying to figure out how to confront her, how to sever the life we shared without breaking down. Today, I didn't hesitate. I could feel it in my bones, the resolve, the clarity I'd been waiting for. She was still asleep, breathing softly next to me, looking peaceful and unaware. I stared at her for a moment, and it struck me how easily she'd carried on with her deception. Right beside me, without so much as a guilty glance. I couldn't even tell what was real anymore. Had she ever loved me? Or had I been a placeholder all along? The day felt like a slow-motion rehearsal. I took time off work, claiming I wasn't feeling well, while she left for her office with her usual peck on my cheek and a warm smile that, now, only made my skin crawl. With her gone, I began making final preparations. I double-checked my legal documents, ensured all the evidence I had was secure, and even moved some personal items to a storage unit as a temporary measure. Every step felt heavy but necessary. Then, I set up my laptop and sent a simple message to my friend, the man I'd once considered a friend. A quick, straightforward note. "Can we talk tonight?" In person, I knew he'd respond, and he did, almost too eagerly, suggesting we meet at a quiet bar. Perfect. There'd be no interruptions, no distractions, just the raw truth in a public space where neither of us could fly off the handle. When I arrived at the bar, he was already there, looking relaxed, even a bit smug. It amazed me that he could face me with that casual demeanor. Given all he'd done, part of me hoped for a flicker of shame, a glimpse of remorse, but all I saw was the guy I'd known for years, who apparently had zero qualms about his betrayal. I sat across from him, feeling every ounce of bitterness rising in my throat. He asked me about work, the camping trip, life in general, making small talk as if he hadn't ripped my life apart behind my back. I could hardly believe his gall. I cut him off mid-sentence, leaning in with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. "I know everything." My voice was steady, each word deliberate. I could see the realization sink in. The moment he understood exactly what I meant, he flinched, and then that smug expression crumbled. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to deny it or play dumb, but I didn't let him. "You didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye and tell me the truth," I said, my voice still even. "You thought you could have it both ways. Keep me as your friend, play with my life, and do God knows what with her. But that stops now." He muttered something about it being a mistake, and how it wasn't supposed to happen. The phrases tumbled out pathetically, like he was rehearsing lines from a bad movie. I didn't want to hear his excuses, and I didn't care about his apologies. "She's all yours," I told him, standing up. "Good luck living with yourselves." I left before he could say anything else, and the satisfaction was immediate, a cold clarity that felt like freedom. I knew he'd probably try to reach out again, try to salvage whatever twisted version of friendship he thought we'd had. But I didn't care. Back at home, I waited until she returned. When she walked in, smiling, I told her we needed to talk. The look on her face changed instantly, from cheerful to cautious, as if she sensed the storm that was about to hit. I motioned for her to sit down, and I could see her trying to gauge my mood, her eyes darting around nervously. "Do you have anything you want to tell me?" I asked, my voice low but direct. She hesitated, looking genuinely startled, as if she hadn't expected this conversation to ever happen. But she said nothing. "Let me save you the trouble," I continued, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the photos. The screenshots, everything I'd saved. I held it out for her to see, and the color drained from her face. She stumbled over her words, saying something about how she never meant for this to happen, how she wasn't thinking straight. But it was all meaningless. I'd heard enough. Her excuses, her lies, her tearful attempts at explanations only confirmed what I'd already known. She started pleading then, begging for forgiveness, for a chance to explain, claiming she loved me and that it was a mistake. But I stood up, keeping my voice steady. "Whatever we had, it ended the moment you chose to betray me," I said. "I won't live a life built on lies. And I won't forgive you for this." The words left her speechless, and I walked away. Heading to the guest room, I turned into my temporary sanctuary. I closed the door behind me, her broken sobs muffled on the other side. I should have felt heartache, devastation, but instead, I felt a sense of closure, like I'd finally taken back control of my own life. For the first time in days, I slept peacefully, knowing that my life, while forever changed, was finally my own again. When I woke up the next day, I felt oddly at peace, a strange sensation, considering how much my life had been turned upside down in the past week. It was like the fog of confusion and heartache had finally cleared. I could see the path forward, even if it wasn't what I had imagined for myself. The house was silent. She hadn't slept in the guest room. I could only assume she'd either stayed with a friend or found some temporary place to go for the night. I'd given her my ultimatum. She knew there was no going back from what she'd done. No amount of apologizing would rewrite the betrayal or erase the images seared into my mind. Throughout the day, I began the slow process of disentangling our lives. Our shared bank accounts needed to be divided, the joint lease sorted, and I needed to find a lawyer. I made each call with a strange calmness, approaching it like I would any task at work, step by step, methodically, without letting emotions cloud my judgment. This wasn't a time for hesitation. Every second spent stalling only prolonged the inevitable. By late afternoon, my lawyer was scheduled, and my bank accounts were protected. I even took the extra step to secure my personal finances, ensuring that the inheritance my parents left me would be shielded from the storm that was about to break. Around 6, she returned home. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from what I assumed was a night spent crying or confronting the fallout with him. I could feel her watching me as I stood in the kitchen, tidying up, maybe trying to gauge if I'd softened at all since last night. But I had nothing left to give her. "I'm here to get my things," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. There was no fight in her, just resignation. "Do what you need to," I replied, stepping aside. I wasn't angry anymore, I was just done. I watched as she quietly packed a few bags, stuffing in essentials, grabbing clothes, and then slipping out of the room to gather whatever she might need in the coming days. She moved around the house with a strange familiarity, as if she were still welcome. Yet her presence felt foreign, almost intrusive. In the evening, she tried again to talk to me, to make a final appeal. "Can we please just talk?" she said, her voice shaking. "There's so much we could still work through. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." I didn't even look up. The time for words had passed. Her actions had spoken louder than anything she could say now. "I've said everything I need to," I answered calmly. "The damage is done, and I don't see a future here anymore." She fell silent, her shoulders slumping as she realized I meant it. There was no sudden epiphany, no dramatic plea that could sway me now. She packed the last of her things and left, the door closing behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty house. I heard her car pull away, and with it went the remnants of our life together. Over the next few days, I adjusted to the new normal. The house felt quieter, almost unnervingly so, but there was a freedom in it. I no longer had to look over my shoulder or question everything I thought I knew. Friends reached out, offering support and a place to stay if I ever needed a break. But I felt grounded for the first time. My closest friends, once shocked, rallied around me, giving me the strength to keep moving forward. In their voices, I found reminders of who I was before this betrayal, of the life I could still have. Free from the deception that had tainted my world, work became my refuge. It was easier to pour myself into projects and meetings than to reflect too long on what had happened. People respected my silence, giving me the space I needed to heal without demanding explanations or updates. I settled into the rhythm, one day at a time, focusing on building something new, something that couldn't be shattered. By the end of the month, I had my own place lined up, a small, sunlit apartment on the other side of town. A fresh start. My lawyer had nearly finished the paperwork, and the formalities of our separation were drawing to a close. Everything about my life was changing, and although it wasn't what I'd envisioned, I found comfort in the idea of a clean slate. One evening, after I'd finally settled into the new apartment, I sat on the couch, surrounded by boxes waiting to be unpacked. I didn't rush to fill the space, I wanted to savor the emptiness. The quiet peace that settled around me like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax, to close my eyes and let go of the weight I'd been carrying. And in that silence, I found a strange sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it had brought. I'd been given a chance to rebuild, to reclaim a life that was truly mine, unshadowed by lies or hidden agendas. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready to face it. The finality of moving out began to hit as I looked around our old house one last time. I hadn't returned since I found my own place, but I had to pick up a few remaining things and finalize a couple of legal documents with her. I knew she'd be here, and I couldn't avoid this last confrontation any longer. It was time to close the door, not just on the house, but on everything we'd shared. The door creaked as I stepped inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face tense, her fingers fiddling with a pen as though it was her last lifeline. I'd prepared myself for this, but the moment brought a wave of complicated emotions. She looked up when she saw me, her eyes soft and pleading, though I couldn't tell if it was for forgiveness or closure. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, crossing the room and sitting down across from her. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken words and memories neither of us wanted to relive. She looked as though she was searching for a way to begin, her gaze flickering around the room as if she could escape from what needed to be said. But I had no intention of dragging it out any further. "Let's just get through this," I said, keeping my tone steady. I had come to find peace, not to rekindle old wounds. She nodded, sliding a document across the table. It was one of the final things we needed to sign regarding the house. I barely glanced at it before signing my name, pushing it back to her. "Is there anything else?" I asked, wanting to cut the conversation short, to leave before she could pull me into an emotional pit I wasn't ready to revisit. "Actually, yes," she hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a moment. "I need you to know, it was never about you." Her words felt like a slap. I didn't need any more justifications. I'd thought long and hard over the past few weeks, and the details of why or how she'd betrayed me didn't change the outcome. Still, I listened, if only to give her the closure she seemed to need. "I was lost," she continued. "I didn't know who I was. And I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I know that, and I know I hurt you. I sighed, glancing at her, my anger and hurt buried deep but not erased. You didn't just hurt me. You dismantled the life we built. The trust, the love, everything we had. She swallowed, a flash of guilt crossing her face. But it didn't give me any satisfaction. Whatever guilt she carried was her burden now. I had spent too much time carrying her mistakes. And I was done with it. There's nothing you can say to fix this, I said, my voice gentler than I expected. But I hope you find the peace you're looking for. She nodded, her face softening with resignation. I could tell that, for her, the weight of what she'd done was settling in. The realization that this wasn't just a mistake she could move past, that it had consequences that stretched far beyond her own life. I stood, pushing my chair back and feeling the finality of the moment. She didn't stop me, didn't ask for forgiveness or another chance. She knew, as I did, that whatever we once had was gone. It had died the moment she decided to betray my trust. As I turned to leave, I heard her whisper, "I'm sorry. I didn't look back. I didn't need to." I walked out the door, feeling the cool air hit me as I stepped into a life free of betrayal, of secrets, of hidden glances and half-truths. It was just me, on my own, and for the first time, I felt the weight lift. The chapter was over. The drive back to my new apartment was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't call anyone. I let myself sit with the quiet, embracing the solitude that I'd once feared. This time, though, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt liberating, like I'd finally reclaimed my own life, my own peace. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting a warm glow across the walls of my apartment. It was small, unfurnished in parts, and far from perfect, but it was mine. There was no deceit hiding in the corners, no hidden messages waiting to be discovered. Just my life, my space, my fresh start. I sat down by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that felt like a promise, a reminder that life goes on, even after heartbreak. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. The journey wasn't over, but I was on my way. The aftermath of betrayal is like a fog, thick and unyielding, making it hard to see a way forward. The shock had worn off by now, but the bitterness and hurt lingered, dulling the joy in even the smallest things. Friends, well-meaning as they were, advised me to dive into work, to pick up hobbies, to stay too busy to think. I took their advice at first, letting distraction be my medicine, hoping that maybe if I worked hard enough, the pain would dissipate. But, of course, it never really does. What did change was my perspective on healing. I stopped avoiding the hurt, stopped drowning it out, and began to face it head on. I started therapy, which felt almost laughable at first, just me, sitting in a chair talking to a stranger about my inner chaos, hoping they had answers. But gradually, those sessions became like a compass, helping me navigate through the mistrust, anger, and confusion that swirled around me. A lot of the work was simply unpacking my own story, who I was before all this, how I'd lost myself along the way, and what I needed to rebuild. My therapist asked questions that felt almost painfully obvious, questions I'd avoided for years because I was too focused on what I thought I should be doing rather than what I wanted. What does happiness look like for you, right now, without any conditions? I didn't have an answer. Not at first. I'd spent so much of my life living up to expectations, filling roles, and making sacrifices. It was strange, even liberating, to think that maybe happiness wasn't as complicated as I'd made it out to be. Over time, I began setting boundaries, a concept that felt foreign and almost selfish at first. I realized I'd spent years accommodating others, bending to meet their needs while my own fell by the wayside. But I started small, choosing who I spent time with, deciding how to spend my weekends. Even something as simple as saying no to invitations I didn't feel up to attending. Little by little, these boundaries allowed me the space I needed to reconnect with myself. And then came forgiveness, but not the kind I'd ever imagined. It wasn't about forgiving her or my former friend, it was about forgiving myself for trusting so blindly. For ignoring the little instincts that nudged me along the way, telling me something wasn't right. I let go of the need to punish myself for being fooled. I'd loved fully, and I wasn't going to apologize for that. In the midst of all this introspection, I noticed other aspects of my life slowly shifting. Work became more fulfilling as I poured myself into it. Not as a distraction but as something that genuinely brought me satisfaction. Friends who had stayed by my side, who had listened to my anger and held space for my grief. Felt more like family now. I started to see relationships differently, valuing depth over quantity, sincerity over social obligation. Living alone gave me a freedom I hadn't anticipated. I'd always believed that a full house was synonymous with happiness. Yet, the quiet became something I cherished. A stark contrast to the chaos I'd unknowingly lived with. I got to know myself in a way that felt almost like reuniting with an old friend. My thoughts were my own, undiluted and honest, filling the silence in ways that felt grounding instead of isolating. Months passed, and one evening, as I was cooking a simple dinner for myself, I realized I was no longer thinking about her. About them. The pangs of hurt had dulled into memories. No longer sharp or angry. Just there. It felt like I'd crossed an invisible threshold. Finally able to reflect on what happened without feeling bound by it. I found myself grateful for where I was. The experience, painful as it had been, had brought me to a place of authenticity. I didn't have everything figured out. And there were moments that still stung. Memories that still surfaced. But I knew I was building something real. Something that was mine. This life I was shaping now didn't depend on someone else's promises, but on my own choices. My own vision of happiness. The journey wasn't over, and maybe it never truly would be. But I was on the path now. Steady and unafraid. And that, I realized, was enough. Time has a strange way of moving forward even when it feels like everything is stuck. Months slipped by as I pieced together my life, filling the spaces left empty with bits of growth, resilience, and even a sense of peace. I'd been creating a routine, learning to live within this new reality, finding comfort in the stability I'd built. But the universe, as it often does, had other plans. One Saturday morning, just as I was about to head out for a hike, a new ritual I'd come to love, the doorbell rang. Standing on my front step was someone I hadn't seen in ages, Sarah. A mutual friend from my college days, who'd stayed in casual touch with both my wife and me over the years. She was someone I'd known long before everything had unraveled. Before marriage, betrayals, and the fallout. The sight of her there, smiling and holding a coffee in each hand, stirred something within me, a reminder of a simpler time. Thought I'd drop by since I was in the area, she said, handing me one of the cups. I invited her in, surprised yet genuinely glad to see her. We chatted about her family, her job, all the usual topics. The years had flown by, yet it felt as if we hadn't skipped a beat. But eventually, she leaned in, her voice growing quiet, and mentioned that she'd recently heard from my ex-wife. My heart froze for a moment, the familiar tension wrapping around me like an old coat. She's been asking about you, Sarah admitted, her eyes searching my face, as if trying to gauge how I'd take the news. She knows you've been moving forward, focusing on yourself. She said she'd realized a lot, but I don't think she'd reach out unless you wanted her to. I didn't need the details to know what that meant. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to claim I was past all that, past her, but deep down, I knew there was a weight that hadn't fully lifted. I hadn't yet confronted the final piece. That missing closure that hovered like a shadow in the background. Sarah's visit brought back old feelings. Not of love or regret, but of curiosity, about how the story could close. Truly, this time, I thanked Sarah, and as I closed the door after her, a rush of conflicting emotions washed over me. Could there be any closure worth seeking? And what would it even look like? The next day, I was going through my phone, deleting old contacts I no longer used, clearing away the clutter. That's when I stumbled upon my ex-wife's number. My thumb hovered over the screen, the urge to text her or call her itching at me. I hadn't reached out since we separated, had convinced myself that contact would only make things worse. But now, I wondered if facing her, truly facing her, without anger or bitterness, was what I needed to release myself fully. I didn't make the call that day, but over the next few weeks, the thought lingered, pushing at me gently, as if some part of me knew I needed this for myself. Not for her. Finally, on a quiet Wednesday evening, I dialed her number. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice soft and familiar yet somehow different. We exchanged pleasantries, small talk that felt oddly surreal, like we were two actors in a scene we never rehearsed. After a pause, I asked the question that had been sitting on my chest since that day on the camping trip. What happened? The words came out calmly, without accusation, simply a request for the truth. She sighed, And in that sigh, I heard something I hadn't expected: regret. She explained the confusion, the loneliness she had felt during those years, and how she'd convinced herself that I was growing distant. Her words didn't excuse her actions, didn't erase the choices she made, but they painted a picture of someone who was deeply flawed and struggling. In hearing her side, I realized that while I'd been dealing with my own hurts, she'd been struggling with her own sense of inadequacy and need for validation. Listening to her story didn't make what she did right, but it brought a clarity I didn't know I needed. I felt the knots of anger, betrayal, and resentment loosen, slipping away piece by piece. When she finished, we sat in silence for a while, two people tied by memories, but no longer bound by the pain they once held. I thanked her for her honesty, and we both knew, without saying it, that this was the last conversation we'd ever have. When I hung up, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. I'd always thought that moving on was about leaving things behind, burying them deep, and never looking back. But as I stood there, I realized that sometimes, healing means allowing yourself to face the very things you wanted to ignore. It was like letting the final embers of an old fire burn out completely, until there was nothing left but a faint warmth and ashes that could blow away in the wind. That night, for the first time in over a year, I slept peacefully, without ghosts lingering in the corners of my mind. I had faced the past, had seen it for what it was, and finally allowed it to fade. The path before me felt clearer, open, and wholly mine, ready for whatever lay ahead. With that last conversation behind me, life began to shift subtly but significantly. It felt as if I'd been holding my breath for years. And now, finally, I could exhale. It wasn't just about the end of my marriage, it was the end of carrying something that had grown heavy without me noticing. I had no illusion that everything would be perfect from here on out. But there was a freedom in knowing that I was finally ready to build a life that felt true to who I'd become. In the weeks that followed, I began to redefine routines and the spaces in my life where I had once felt stuck. Mornings became a time for walking through the quiet streets of my neighborhood before the world fully woke up. Finding clarity in the solitude of those early hours, I started trying new things. Saying yes to invitations I would have once passed on, and even took a couple of weekend trips by myself, exploring places I'd always wanted to see but never made time for. Friendships grew deeper as well. I leaned on my friends in a way I hadn't before, no longer hiding behind a facade of having it all together. We would talk late into the night, trading life stories, regrets, and hopes for the future. I realized how much I'd taken for granted in their steadfast presence. And I began to understand that true companionship isn't about perfection, it's about showing up for each other. Flaws and all. Surprisingly, as I settled into this new normal, my work began to evolve. Too, I took on projects with fresh enthusiasm, bringing a spark of creativity that I hadn't felt in years. My boss noticed and suggested I lead a new initiative, something I'd once thought was beyond my capabilities. But now, with this new clarity and confidence, I didn't hesitate. I accepted the challenge, eager to build something meaningful, not just for the company, but for myself. I wanted to prove to myself that I could create and lead, that I could push forward without the weight of the past holding me back. One evening, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the familiar objects I'd accumulated over the years. It was the same space, yet it felt transformed, like I was seeing it through new eyes. Each corner of the room held a memory, some bittersweet, but none that hurt anymore. I had found a sense of peace in allowing those memories to be just that, pieces of a life that had shaped me, but didn't define where I was headed. As for relationships, I wasn't rushing into anything. For now, I was content with myself, getting to know who I was outside the confines of what had once been. I knew that one day, I might find someone new, but it would be on my terms, with the lessons of the past guiding me instead of haunting me. For the first time, I felt open to whatever the future held, confident that I could handle it on my own if need be. Looking back, it's strange to think of how one moment can alter the course of a lifetime. That glimpse of betrayal, the truth hidden in messages, the choices I had to make, they all seemed insurmountable at the time. But now, they were merely chapters in a story that continued, a story I was proud to own. Standing on my balcony that evening, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. I wasn't the same person I had been, and for the first time, I could say that I was truly okay with that. I had learned to let go of what was never truly mine and had stepped into a life that felt, finally, like it belonged to me. And as the sky shifted from gold to deep indigo, I looked out toward the horizon, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, I was ready. I had come through the fire, scarred but whole, and more than anything, I knew that I was enough.